In a barren stretch of land in modern-day Anatolia, a team of archaeologists works under a blistering sun. Their brushes move delicately over layers of dust and centuries of silence. What began as a routine excavation of a Bronze Age settlement turns into something extraordinary when a trench reveals the twisted remains of dozens of ancient soldiers. Their skeletons lie intertwined, some locked in what seems like the final moments of combat, others arranged with strange precision. Bronze spearheads pierce ribcages, and fragments of shields still cling to bone. The air is dry, but the discovery sends a chill through everyone present. Among the bones, the team notices markings carved into several skulls, symbols that do not resemble wounds from battle but deliberate engravings. A lead archaeologist, Dr. Leora Benyamin, whispers the words that will define the discovery. This isn't just a grave. It's a ritual. The cameras record the scene, close-ups of the engravings, the positioning of the bodies, the traces of ash and charred wood surrounding the pit. Someone had buried these men with intention, with meaning. But was it an act of reverence, or of condemnation? The narrator's voice begins softly over the slow rhythm of excavation tools. These soldiers died over 3,000 years ago, yet their story is only now resurfacing. The soil has preserved their secret, keeping it safe from wind, war, and time itself. Their final moments were brutal, but what happened after death might have been even more haunting. As the bones are lifted, one by one, patterns begin to emerge. Some bodies are buried with bronze ornaments, while others are face down, stripped of any possession. The difference feels deliberate, a division between those who were honored and those who were shamed. Each unearthed fragment deepens the mystery. The pit isn't random, it's circular, surrounded by what appears to be a boundary of large stones, perhaps a sacred perimeter. Charcoal samples suggest the site was burned shortly after burial. Pottery fragments found nearby bear traces of red pigment, possibly blood mixed with clay. To the archaeologists, these details point to something more than a mass burial. It might have been a ceremony, a ritual born from war and belief, where the dead were not merely laid to rest, but offered. The film slows, letting the camera linger on the silent faces of the excavation team. In their eyes, awe mixes with unease. They are not just uncovering history, they are disturbing an ancient story about how people once made sense of death in war. The narrator speaks again, his voice heavy with curiosity. What does it mean to bury a soldier alive in ritual? To believe that death itself can serve the gods? Slowly, modern instruments fade from view. The scene transitions through a visual dissolve. The archaeological pit becomes a battlefield of the past, still fresh with life and terror. The wind of the present morphs into the roar of war drums. We are pulled thousands of years backward, to a time when men fought under the gaze of unforgiving gods, when every fallen soldier was more than a casualty, they were part of a sacred transaction between mortals and the divine. And so begins the journey to uncover what these graves truly mean. Were these soldiers buried as heroes, destined for eternal honor, or as cursed souls, buried alive to appease unseen powers? The question lingers in the air, heavy and unsettling. The earth may have buried them, but it never silenced their story. 3,000 years before the archaeologists' discovery, the world was ruled by bronze, blood, and belief. Across the eastern Mediterranean, mighty city-states and warrior kingdoms rose and fell in a cycle of endless conquest. From the citadels of Mycenaean Greece to the stone fortresses of the Hittite Empire and the plains ruled by the Assyrian kings, war was not only a contest for survival, it was a sacred duty. To fight was to serve the gods, to die was to join them. Yet in this age of divine warfare, the line between honor and horror was perilously thin. In the Bronze Age, battle was not fought by faceless armies. It was a collision of families, tribes, and faiths. Soldiers marched to war carrying small amulets or clay figurines of their household gods, believing divine favor could shield them from death. Before the clash, priests would walk among the warriors, sprinkling blood from sacrificed animals onto the earth, dedicating the battlefield to their deities. The sky itself was part of the ceremony, omens read in the flight of birds, the direction of the wind, or the shape of clouds. Every sword drawn was a prayer, every wound, a judgment from above. Among the Mycenaeans, the concept of kleos, glory that outlived death, defined a warrior's existence. The worst fate was not to die in battle, but to die forgotten, without song or story. In their burial chambers, the fallen were laid with golden masks and weapons, their names etched into stone to ensure their spirits endured. But elsewhere, in lands where the gods were less forgiving, death could be an act of punishment. The Hittites believed that souls of those who died in shame or cowardice could become restless, trapped between worlds. Such spirits were thought to bring drought or plague, so priests performed elaborate rites to bind them underground, rites that may explain the strange markings found on the Anatolian skeletons unearthed thousands of years later. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrians took this further. Their kings claimed divine mandate from Ashur, the chief god of war. When an enemy army fell, their bodies were often left unburied as an offering of vengeance to the gods. The battlefield became a sacred landscape, a place where the divine and the mortal worlds met through destruction. Ancient records describe these events in chilling detail: captured foes impaled at city gates, their corpses left as warnings to the living. To us, these acts appear monstrous, but to the Assyrians, they were a spiritual necessity, a way to cleanse the earth of defilement and affirm the gods' dominion over men. Across all these cultures, the warrior's relationship with death was complex. He was taught to embrace it, to see his final breath as the beginning of immortality. Yet beneath the surface lingered fear of being denied burial, of having one's body left to rot in the sun. Without burial, the soul wandered eternally, unable to rest or reach the afterlife. This was the terror that haunted every soldier before battle, not the sword or the spear, but the thought of being erased. It is this fear that shaped ancient burial rituals, practices that mixed reverence with dread, love with obedience to divine law. Through inscriptions, funerary art, and surviving texts, we glimpse the mindset of these ancient fighters. A Mycenaean warrior carved into a stele stands proud, spear raised, his name preserved forever. In contrast, an Assyrian relief shows the conquered enemy trampled under the hooves of divine horses, nameless and broken. Every civilization defined death in war according to its own values. Some turned it into legend, others into warning. The narrator's voice deepens as the visuals shift between gleaming bronze helmets and smoking pyres. To die in war was to fulfill the will of the gods, he says, but to die dishonored was to become a ghost. We begin to understand how spiritual logic could transform the battlefield into a place of ritual, where bloodshed was both sacrifice and salvation. As the section closes, the tone grows darker. The narrator pauses over the image of a storm rolling across the Anatolian hills. But faith can sanctify cruelty, he continues. When victory turns to massacre, when priests walk among the corpses chanting prayers, where does reverence end and horror begin? The camera moves slowly back toward the pit from the first scene, now imagined in its original time. The bodies lie not as victims of chaos, but as part of something deliberate. The soldiers who fought believing they would be remembered may have instead become instruments of ritual. The question left hanging is not only what these people believed, but how far belief could go when guided by fear and divine command. The wind rises, carrying the sound of distant drums. As the light fades, the narrator leads us deeper into this world of sacred violence. In the next chapter of their story, we will see what happens when the gods themselves demand blood, not from the living, but from the dead. The world we now enter is one of silence and shadow, the aftermath of a battle long forgotten, where the victors walk among the slain with reverence and fear. The year is around 1200 BCE. The sun sets over the hills of ancient Anatolia, its last light falling across a field soaked with blood. The clash is over. Bronze weapons lie scattered in the dust, broken shields marking where men fell. Smoke rises from burning wagons and shattered chariots. The survivors move cautiously, whispering prayers, for in their minds, the ground beneath them is no longer merely earth, it is sacred, claimed by the gods through death. Archaeologists today believe this battlefield, uncovered near the ancient city of Arslantepe, might hold evidence of one of the oldest known ritual burials of defeated warriors. The mass pit discovered there is not the chaotic grave of desperation. It is arranged, deliberate, ceremonial. Bodies were placed in spirals, their faces turned toward the east, the direction of the rising sun, a gesture that may have symbolized rebirth or subjugation. Burnt residue lines the edge of the pit, mixed with fragments of pottery and charred animal bones, evidence of offerings made before the burial began. The soldiers, it seems, were not merely laid to rest, they were given to something. In reconstructed scenes, priests wrapped in linen and covered in ash stand over the corpses. The air is thick with incense and smoke. They chant hymns to the storm gods, their words rising and falling like the rhythm of breath. Warriors who survived the battle kneel nearby, their armor still stained with the blood of comrades and foes alike. They do not look at the pit directly. To gaze upon it is to risk drawing the attention of the restless dead. The high priest raises his bronze dagger and pours wine and animal blood into the earth, sealing the sacrifice. Then, one by one, the soldiers' bodies are lowered, some with care, others roughly, depending on their status in the battle. The victors are buried first, their weapons beside them, their spirits appeased. The defeated are buried last, face down, stripped of every possession, bound at the wrists with twine made from reeds. It is a chilling ritual of hierarchy even in death. Why would anyone do this? The answer lies in belief. Ancient peoples feared that the spirits of violent death could not rest. The more unjust or horrific the end, the more likely the soul would rise again to haunt the living. To prevent this, the dead had to be bound by ritual. Burial alive, sometimes partial, sometimes symbolic, was one such method. Some were buried under a thin layer of soil before suffocating, their deaths believed to feed the underworld gods who demanded life for life. Others were buried with their mouths filled with clay or stones, a symbolic silencing of their voices so they could not curse the victors from beyond. This was not an isolated practice. In Hittite religious texts, there are references to the sleeping of the enemy, a rite performed after great battles to seal the spirits of the defeated beneath the world. Similar rituals appear in early Mesopotamian lore, where fallen enemies were buried beneath city gates to serve as eternal guardians, or prisoners, of the realm. The dead became part of the landscape, their bones transformed into a spiritual barrier that protected the living from vengeance. Back at the site, the archaeologists' findings match these ancient descriptions uncannily. The ashes contain traces of barley and animal fat, offerings known to be used in appeasement rituals. The soil's strange red coloration is not from rust, but from ochre pigment, long associated with blood symbolism and renewal. On one skull, markings shaped like a sunburst radiate from the forehead, as if representing the soul's surrender to divine light. Each detail reinforces the theory, this was no burial of mercy. It was a covenant with gods of war and death. The narrator's tone deepens as the camera drifts over the reconstructed ritual. These men were buried not for remembrance, but for restraint, he says. They were the voices the living feared to hear again. The eerie chanting fades into the hum of wind over stone, and for a moment, it is easy to believe that something still stirs in the pit, an echo of pain, bound but not forgotten. As the scene closes, the priests finish their work. The final body is lowered. The pit is filled with soil mixed with ash and salt, sealing it forever. The survivors turn their backs, walking away without looking behind them. For them, the ritual is not cruelty, it is salvation. To appease the gods means to survive another day. To them, the dead are not victims, but offerings, bridges between mortality and the divine order. The narrator pauses as the image of the pit fades into darkness. To the ancients, he murmurs, death was not an ending, it was a duty. But what happens when the duty to the gods becomes indistinguishable from the cruelty of men? The music swells with a low, tense hum. Slowly, the perspective begins to shift once more. The burial pit dissolves into a stone tumulus, a grand mound shining beneath the sun of Greece. For some, the narrator continues, death was a curse. But for others, it was the beginning of immortality. The world of the condemned dead fades, and the light of heroes begins to rise. The smoke of ritual fades, and sunlight spills across marble and bronze. We are in ancient Greece, where death in battle was not a curse but a calling. To die with courage was to live forever. When warriors fell at marathon or salamis, they were cremated with honors, their ashes placed in great tumuli that rose above the earth like man-made hills of glory. Citizens came each year to pour oil, wine, and honey upon their graves, feeding the memory of those who had given their lives for the polis. Nowhere is this belief clearer than in the story of Achilles. Struck down at Troy, his body was burned upon a pyre and buried beside his companion, Patroclus. His tomb became a shrine, a symbol that death could be transcended through remembrance. The Greeks called it Kleos, immortal fame, the song that outlives the flesh. Across the Mediterranean, others followed. The Etruscans filled painted tombs with feasting scenes, believing warriors would dine forever in the afterlife. Pharaohs in Egypt buried their soldiers with chariots and offerings to join them in eternity. Death, once feared, became proof of divine favor. Yet behind this reverence lay power. Public funerals, orations, and monuments turned loss into loyalty, grief into unity. States used the dead to teach the living that sacrifice was the highest virtue. The narrator's voice softens, but for every hero remembered in stone, countless others were swallowed by the soil. The marble gleam fades to dust, the songs to silence. The camera lowers once more, toward the forgotten graves, those buried not in glory, but in disgrace. The glory of heroes gives way to darkness. Across ancient empires, burial became a weapon of power. The Assyrians entombed rebels alive beneath palace gates, their bodies crushed into the very foundations of the king's city. In Nineveh and Calhu, archaeologists have found twisted skeletons under thresholds, human walls meant to hold rebellion at bay. To them, it was divine justice. Those who defied the ruler must serve him even in death. Far to the west, Carthage practiced its own grim devotion. When war or famine struck, soldiers and children were offered to Baal Hammon, burned or buried in sacred tophets to restore divine favor. Myth or truth, the soil bears witness. Urns of ash, small bones, and carved steely marked with raised hands in supplication. In China, the pattern reached its most chilling perfection. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, demanded eternal protection. Thousands of prisoners and laborers were entombed alive around his vast mausoleum, sealing themselves into darkness so their spirits might guard him forever. The terracotta army above is a monument to that unseen sacrifice. Everywhere, rulers sought to erase memory through burial. Rebels were denied names, traitors denied graves. The Romans called it damnatio memoriae, the destruction of remembrance. To erase a person from history was to kill them twice. The narrator's tone drops. You can bury a body, but to bury a name is to destroy the soul. Over images of ruins and bones, the world feels haunted by silence. The earth becomes both tomb and archive, a record of cruelty disguised as ritual. Then, faintly, a whisper, but silence never lasts forever. The camera rises toward the light, and the dig site reappears. The dead are about to speak once more. The morning sun returns. Where once priests chanted, scientists now kneel with brushes and scanners. The same soil that hid the dead now yields them gently. For 3,000 years, the narrator begins, they lay forgotten. Now the earth itself remembers. Each artifact tells a fragment of life, a ring still clinging to bone, a fragment of armor, a pottery shard etched with words of prayer. Carbon dating reveals the soldiers came from distant lands, drawn together in war. What was once myth becomes human again. Sons, fathers, brothers lost to time. Historians decipher symbols from the site. May the earth bind, and may the gods forgive. What once looked like cruelty now feels like desperate reverence. A people seeking peace through sacrifice. These rituals, though harsh, were born not from hate but fear of chaos and the unknown. The camera moves across the landscape, fields, trees, and villages built upon forgotten graves. The past, the narrator says, is never silent. It speaks through the dust, the stones, the roots beneath our feet. The tone shifts from mourning to awe. An archaeologist pauses before sealing a relic box. Her hand lingers over a skull. They were buried to be silenced, she whispers, but we can still hear them. The music swells softly. As twilight descends, the camera rises high above the site. The pit glows golden in the dying sun, a scar and a monument. The narrator's final words echo over the horizon. Empires forget. Stones crumble. But the earth remembers. Fade to black. The sound of wind and heartbeat merges. The eternal rhythm of those once buried alive, now finally heard.